Hello students, let's work on chapter 16. This is socio-emotional development in late adulthood. So this is one of our last chapters. So with it, as well as talking about socio-emotional development in late adulthood, we will also be talking about the theories of development. So we covered this in the first couple chapters of the book, and we will review it here as well. So, there's actually a video on ePortfolios for Salt Lake Community College that I have linked in a weekly email. Alright, so we don't have to go through these slides right now. Alright, so let's talk about some theories of socio-emotional development and get a review of socio-emotional development through the lifespan. So let's talk first about Erikson. So we've talked about Erikson almost every chapter so far, because Erikson and Piaget were some of the first developmental theorists. So a lot of work that we've done in the field built off of what they did. You hopefully have seen through the last chapters places where their observations matched up, their ideas matched up, and were really useful, and we still kind of use them, and you might see those evolutions, as well as some of the places where we've moved so far away from the things that they said that it's not really as useful to talk about them. So I don't like to dwell on them too much, but since we've touched on them so many times, I do want to get this overall view of their ideas. So in late adulthood specifically, Erikson thought this was a time of looking for integrity versus despair. And so that involves reflecting, like older adults, reflecting on their past and trying to piece together things into kind of a positive narrative, and either doing that, realizing that a lot of their life has been positive, they've done all these meaningful things, XYZ is really important to them, or being a little more in despair because their life hasn't been what they wanted it to be. Maybe they have a lot of regrets, or they wish they did a lot of things differently. So they might have integrity about their life or be a little in despair about their life. So the life review is that process of looking back at their life and interpreting, reinterpreting in light of where they are now, essentially their identity and what they did based on their behaviors, based on what they believe now. So with that, reminiscence therapy can help with older adults and still used today, essentially discussing past events and experiences with an individual or group, kind of trying to recontextualize them, fit them into a more positive light, can be really helpful if someone is feeling a little despair about their lifespan, or pointing out things that are really positive that they might be ignoring, especially if they have kind of a negative bias. So let's look at Erikson over the lifespan. So as you remember, there were a lot of things that he thought at the very beginning of life, infancy, early childhood, preschool. There's a lot of different phases there, and then a lot of changes. Then as we get older, there are bigger time spans. That still is the same now. So remember, in infancy, we had that trust versus mistrust. And so with that, that was really important with feeding and comfort, starting to get that attachment for the child, even though they're probably not cognitively thinking this at the time. The main question is, are they safe? So can they trust the people around them, their caregivers? So if they're given affection, given food reliably, they'll learn to trust. And again, all these things Erikson thought in his theory that you had to meet them or you're not going to be able to move on to the next socio-emotional stage. So in early childhood, assuming that you were trusting, you could work on autonomy versus shame and doubt. And if you remember that, that's from about ages 2 to 3. So this is related to, can you do things by myself, or do you always need to rely on other people? My son the other day, for example, he went to get a milk out of the fridge, and it was a little high for him, so I was like, here, let me help you. And he's like, no, I can do it myself. And he's 3 right now, so he's just about out of that point. So children are developing that sense of personal control, realizing there's things that they can do. My 3-year-old putting on his shoes all by himself, cleaning up his room, picking books that he wants to read at night, those kinds of things. So if they see they're successful in these things, they'll have a lot of positive outcomes. And Erikson thought then they could, at about 3 to 5, move on to this initiative versus guilt. And basically this was kind of Erikson's idea of, well, does this child think they're good or bad? Are they feeling a lot of guilt? Are they taking initiative? Are they starting games on their own? Are they initiating conversations with people? Are they choosing their own things that they're doing? You might see this on a playground, especially in like preschool or kindergarten. So as children age, 6 to 11, Erikson thought this was a time of industry versus inferiority, and looking at how are they doing well? Are they meeting the social expectations of them at this age? So they have new academic demands. They have new responsibilities with friends and things like that. So they feel competent with those. Are they doing well in school? Are there areas that they're struggling in, or do they feel inferior and like they're not as good as maybe their peers? Adolescence, hopefully this is more recent, so hopefully you remember these ones. We have identity versus role confusion. Erikson thought all of identity was figured out in adolescence. Who you are, what's important to you. Oh, there goes the cat again. This way. Yeah, that way. So figuring out your sense of self, moving that to be a full identity. Then in young adulthood, I thought that was very much focused, and that was a big age span. Intimacy versus isolation. Are you loved? Are you wanted? Do you have close relationships with other people? So you can see how this is really important and really focused on socio-emotional development. Erikson also had some ideas about cognitive development, but a lot of what he did was focused on socio-emotional. So success leads to strong relationships, failures are loneliness and isolation, and it's a really critical thing that people are concerned about at this time, he thought. I would say, looking at the lifespan, these relationships are important throughout the lifespan. So you can look at that attachment relationship in childhood, friends or like in infancy attachment relationship. You can look at friends in childhood, friends through lifespan actually, and then partners in even late adolescence and young adulthood, all throughout the rest of the lifespan. This kind of intimacy versus isolation is kind of a critical socio-emotional driver throughout the lifespan, not just in this one segment of time. Middle adulthood, we talked about generativity versus stagnation. Generativity is, are you generating things that are good for the community, for the business you're working with? Are you leaving things to the next generation to be good and to help them build? You might be mentoring someone, things like that. And then maturity and ego identity versus despair is what we just talked about. So looking back on your life near the end of it, have you done things as you wanted to? Do you have integrity about your life? Or do you have a lot of regrets and feel like you were a failure in some ways? So those are Erikson's ideas throughout the lifespan. Let's talk also, and here it is all in one page. So if that's easier for you to review and look at, you can do that. So with that, let's remind ourselves also of these periods of development. We've got this prenatal period, infancy, early childhood, middle and late childhood, and all of those are pretty well agreed on that these are their age ranges. Adolescence, some people say it's pretty early, even up to age 10, but generally people agree by 13 it's definitely started, and then people kind of disagree of when it ends. So whether we should consider 19 adolescence or even 18 adolescence, or if that's early adulthood. So these are kind of the ages that we have set out. All right, so let's remember Bronfenbrenner's bioecological theory. So essentially that any individual, when we started this class, in prenatal stage, so say there's a fetus, right? So there's a fetus and then they're born, so it's now a infant inside different contexts. Their microsystems are those that they are interacting with every day. So parents, siblings, as they get into childhood, maybe school. If they're in late adulthood, there might not be a workplace anymore, but they might have a religious community that's part of their microsystem, that they're interacting with people every day, maybe their own community, their neighborhood. So I've got a couple neighbors that are in late adulthood and they're often talking to each other on their lawn, so they're definitely part of each other's microsystems. They have family that have been visiting them pretty frequently that I've seen. So that family, those extended family like grandkids or even great grandkids, are part of their microsystems. And the mesosystem is the connection between these exosystems and that microsystem. So government services. So for late adults, their health insurance. How is their health insurance relating to their workplace, if they still have a workplace? The economic system. So how does this capitalist system affect their immediate environment, the stores that are available to them, the resources that are available to them, the mass media? How does that affect the people that they're interacting with every day? So are they watching a type of news that makes them think certain things versus other things, And then macro systems are the norms and values of the culture at large. So you could think of those as like the general values that are kind of valued by like everybody in the US, as an example. Well, maybe on average valued by everybody in the US. Then chrono system, pretty easy, time. So these things affect people differently across time. In early childhood, probably school is a big impact of a microsystem, or middle childhood, school is a big impact, versus in late adulthood, there might not be any school relevant to them, right? Unless they are teaching, going back to classes, or something like that. All right, so that one is very similar to Lerner's developmental systems theory. The model looks a little different, but the basic ideas are the same. It just really emphasizes this bidirectional interaction, so that a child or an individual, so again, this could be an adult. I think, do I have a zoomed in? Nope, I don't have a zoomed in picture. So this is a child, or in our case, a late adult, who has their own cognition, biology, temperament, health. So maybe because of their health, their cognitive capacity is lower, or maybe because of their biology, their health is affecting them certain ways, so that their connection with their partner or their social network or something like that is going to be different. They're not able to see them as much because they're not able to get out of the house as much. Maybe they're no longer able to drive. So that's what this is talking about. All those different contexts affecting how this person is living throughout their life. So development is still relatively plastic, even in late adulthood. We've talked about how a lot of cognitive capacities can still be built, even in late adulthood. So the diversity and context that people experience really matters. So two twins even, who go through most of life the same way, but then have vastly different, like, last 10 years of life, might just be difference in context, like one is living in a different community than another, and there's more resources versus less resources, or something like that. So the context people are in really matters to how they develop throughout their life. So, and we also talked about this idea of developmental cascades, that the protective factors or risk factors that you experience might lead you more towards maybe positive outcomes versus negative outcomes. If you've got biological, cognitive problems and a lack of friends nearby, that's a lot of risk factors that might lead you towards maybe negative outcomes or earlier mortality, right? Versus if you have a lot of friends, you have things that you're doing that are meaningful to you, you have family support, you have all those kinds of protective factors, it might lead to a longer lifespan, maybe more health throughout your life, right? So all these things affect you differently. And these last couple, the Bronfenbrenner's, the Lerner's developmental systems, and this developmental cascade, they're all kind of getting at the same thing, that a lot of systems are interacting and affect human development over time. So hopefully you understand those concepts a lot better now, because that's really where lifespan development is now in doing research. So when at this point, it was kind of a while ago when I got my undergrad degree, but when I went through my undergrad, I didn't really learn very much about developmental systems, Bronfenbrenner's. It was like a paragraph of a new theory, essentially. Also probably because the books that were selected were a little old and outdated, because they were cheaper for students, so there's also that problem there. But I definitely want to make sure I emphasize that Bronfenbrenner's bioecological systems theory, Lerner's developmental systems, and this developmental cascades model, these are all really important in research in developmental psychology today. So we've moved away from things like Erikson and Piaget, and we're more looking at how exactly do all these different systems interact with each other to help people develop. So hopefully if you want to go further in your degree in psychology, and specifically with developmental psychology, you understand these concepts a little bit now, because this is what you're going to be learning a lot of when you jump into grad school. And so hopefully I've prepared you a little better than I was prepared for that jump. Like I said, I had never really heard very much about systems theories. And then I jump into grad school, and like 80% of my colleagues around me knew what was going on as we start learning about them in classes and reading papers about them. And I was just kind of blown away. I had to play a little bit of catch up there. So hopefully you're a step ahead. You know more about development and how it actually affects life throughout the lifespan. So with this, we also talked about Vygotsky's sociocultural theory, and I think this one's really important for specifically learning. So hopefully you remember that zone of proximal development. I don't think we need to go over it again since we've hit it so many times, but that's another theory that we've hit on a couple times. So with this, you can probably expect there might be questions about some of these topics I'm talking about right now on the final. Just a little hint for you. Piaget. Yeah, we haven't actually talked about Piaget. I think this slide might be in the wrong place. I thought I had it over by Erickson's. That's okay. So these are the stages that Piaget talked about. Remember, sensory motor, 0 to 2 years, pre-operational stage, 2 to 6, concrete operational, 7 to 12, and then formal operational was about 12 years till the end of lifespan, thinking that our cognition kind of solidified at around that time and was done. So review this slide. Also, later researchers added post-formal operational thinking in early adulthood time, so around the age of 20, but that wasn't Piaget, so it's not actually on this picture. So review those. Again, it's not super important to what we do today. Some of it is, like some of the observations Piaget made are still relevant, but these stages of cognitive development, we've learned most of cognitive development is still really plastic throughout the lifespan. A lot of changes are continuous, so changing all the time, versus stage-like or discontinuous. So hopefully you remember those terms from the very beginning of class. A few things like the sense of self seems to be a discontinuous one, like the wiring in your brain is suddenly to a point where you can now understand you are a separate individual from other people. So things like that are kind of stage-like and discontinuous, but most things are in a lot of the lifespan. Also, depending on the time scale you're looking at, are often continuous development. So just slow and steady development, or quick and steady development. All right, so let's talk about late adults specifically. So one is the activity theory, and it's really important for thinking about the socio-emotional life of late adults. So essentially this is saying that the more active and involved an older adult is, the more likely they're going to have higher well-being, that they'll be satisfied with their lives. So if they are continuing the roles that they had in middle adulthood into late adulthood, so say they were a grandparent, and they're still very much in that role of being a grandparent, getting people together, things like that. If they were a mentor, or they were working, and they were a crafts person or something, whatever their role was that they felt was important to them, or those things that they felt were important to them, if they're continuing those on and still really active in that into late adulthood, they're going to have a lot more satisfaction in their life. They tend to have more health. They tend to have more close relationships. So with that, they can also substitute roles and activities that they can't do anymore. So let's say they used to do a lot of dance, like the couple in this picture here. So let's say they did used to dance a whole lot. Now they're physically not capable. I mean, some late adults obviously are, but I'm just using this as an example. So let's say this person is not capable of dancing anymore. So maybe rather than doing that, they become a judge or something in a dance competition. I don't know. I'm trying to think of things that would be similar that might scratch that itch of wanting to dance kind of thing. Maybe it's because I don't dance that I can't think of any good examples, or I don't dance very well, but that's okay. Definitely not going to demonstrate that to the class. If I was up like talking to a class in person, I might like try to spin around, but sorry, we're on just a computer face to face. I'm well, face to screen essentially. Never mind. Let's continue on. Also, increasing leisure time activities. So things that they found fun and they enjoyed, increasing some time in that, being more active in that tends to leave them more satisfied with life. There's also the socio-emotional selectivity theory, the idea that as they become older, these late adults tend to become more selective about their social network. So maybe in middle adulthood, they had a friend group of, I don't know, let's say 12 people that they would consider pretty close friends. So then maybe in late adulthood, they have a group of, say, 5 people that they consider really, really close friends. So rather than talking to all 12 of those people, they're now talking with only 5 of them really regularly, and they're hanging out with them a lot, basically, or calling them on the phone a lot, or texting, or emailing. So essentially, the idea behind this one is that late adults tend to select and spend more time and energy on those individuals that they have more rewarding relationships with. And because of that, they might not have as big of a friend group, but they have maybe more meaningful friends, or friends that are more meaningful to them specifically. So they might not, having that fewer friends, going from 12 to 5, they might not be lonely or in despair because of that. They might just be using their energy more selectively. Like they decide, I don't have the energy to maintain all these relationships. I'm going to focus on the ones that I care about the most, essentially. And so if they're doing that and they're choosing to do that, they might still have the same or even more satisfaction with their life. So with that, recent research does suggest this might be true for some late adults, but not all. Like, not a common experience. Not all late adults are shrinking their friend groups because they're specifically selecting those friends to spend their time and energy on. So with that, either way, they need to focus on meaningful goals. They can do things like volunteering. They can change their community and foster inclusion better. Communities can also do a lot better job about fostering inclusion of older adults as well. So older adults tend, and we'll talk about this, we'll talk about ageism throughout this lecture, but a lot of programs and people will look at older adults and feel like they are not capable of things that they might expect a younger adult would be capable of. So looking at a 75-year-old versus a 55-year-old and giving more responsibility and giving more responsibility and tasks to the 55-year-old than the 75-year-old, even though the 75-year-old might be more capable, might have better training related to that. So that is a fairly common thing, actually. All right, so with that, throughout the lifespan, people's priorities change. And so a study, I believe this was a cross-sectional study, I don't think this was a longitudinal study, looked at the ways people prioritize different things in their life throughout the lifespan. So at about 25 to 34 years, which is early adulthood, or depending on who you ask, you might say early and the beginning of middle adulthood. So they're prioritizing work first, friends, family, and independence. So work, friends, family. So from in middle adulthood, so 35 to 55, or also you can see some problems with middle adulthood taking up such a big span of time. But from about 35 to 54, still that's a really big span of time. 35 to 54, they really should have broken that up into more categories, I think. The most important thing was family, and then work, and then friends, and then also their cognitive fitness. So I wonder if that would look different from a 35 to 45-year-old versus a 45 to 55-year-old. Then when we go another 10 years forward, 55 to 65, family is at the top, health, friends, cognitive fitness. So now we see health make an appearance, and work is no longer making an appearance. These people maybe don't find that investment in work to be as important. Maybe they're not trying to climb the career ladder, versus a 25 to 34-year-old might really be trying to get into that career. And then you can see 70 to 84, family is most important, health, cognitive fitness, and then also friends. Then 85 to 105, which it's a good thing they got such a lengthy sample into that much into late adulthood. So health was most important, which makes sense because at that point, about 85, we can expect most people's physical health to be declining at that point. A 70 or 75-year-old might not have declining health at that point, but then probably by 85 they will. So health, family, thinking about life, and then cognitive fitness. So there we can see some of that Erikson turning out to be right points, like things that are relevant. So thinking about their life, reflecting, reviewing life, that is something people are tending to do. So good observation Erikson made. All right, so selective affirmation with compensation theory is essentially saying that to successfully age, people need to select specific things to focus on, optimize specific things that they care about optimizing, and then compensate for losses that they might be experiencing. So selection, older adults have a reduced capacity for quite a few things. So for example, physical capacity, we talked about that a lot last or in the previous chapter. A loss of functioning in some ways, and that reduces performance in quite a few of life domains. Like they might not be able to go out and hang out with friends as many days of a week, for example. Optimization is about maintaining. So maintaining performance in areas through continually practicing that, using new technologies. So you can use the example of cognitive development that we've talked about, using new apps to keep your memory skills sharp, or learning a new language, doing things like that to maintain or even in some cases improve your cognitive capacity in certain ways in late adulthood. And then compensation is as abilities are declining, compensating in different ways. So that could be something like a hearing aid, like some help that you call in every couple days or something like that, or learning to compensate by learning different skills to overcome the skills that you're losing. All right, let's talk about personality. So here is the big 5 personality traits: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So personality is correlated with a few things in late adulthood. So conscientiousness predicts lower mortality risk from childhood throughout late adulthood. So all through the lifespan, the risk of death is lower in someone who has high conscientiousness. So again, this is correlational. It's not necessarily that like if you help someone be conscientious, they will absolutely have a lower risk of dying. So that the factors that we call conscientiousness are probably leading to person behaving in a way or being in a certain situation or context that they're in leads to more conscientiousness, and that situation tends to be a little safer for them. So there's a lot of factors there. It's not like if you make someone conscientious, they're going to live longer. It's not a direct causal relationship. Most of these are correlational, actually. I think all of them, but there might be one that's causal. High neuroticism is linked. So again, if you hear that word linked, think correlation, so related to. There's a relationship there, but it's not causal. So neuroticism is linked to negative emotions and predicting higher frailty, which isn't too surprising. So the definition of neuroticism is negative emotions are kind of synonymous with some of the definition of neuroticism. And then it predicts higher frailty, maybe because they're more frail overall, and they do have more physical problems. Maybe they're also a little more neurotic. They have higher neuroticism. So higher conscientiousness is also correlated to a longer life and a reduced risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So higher agreeableness and lower levels of neuroticism, people seem less likely to develop dementia. I think my word choice there is poor. It sounds causal, but that is still a correlational link. So higher levels of conscientiousness, openness to experience, agreeableness, and extroversion, all of those personality traits, so high levels of those, are all correlated to positive emotions. Or maybe it's someone who maybe has the biological ability to feel those emotions stronger or something like that, also has these personality traits or is more likely to have these personality traits. So again, this is correlational. As you can see, I'm kind of emphasizing the idea of correlation versus causation here in this last chapter. That's another thing you might want to review before the final exam. It's also an important thing to understand. So a cause is like A is causing B or C. Correlation is A is related to D, but that's because A is causing B, which is causing C, which is then causing D, or something like that. So correlation means two things are related. I think at the beginning of this class we used the example of ice cream sales being correlated with violent crime. So when violent crime goes up, ice cream sales are also going up, so it's a correlation. These relationships are linked, but what are they linked to? Because people buying more ice cream is not causing people to commit violent crimes. It's actually that it's when it gets hotter, more people do violent crimes, and when it's hotter, more people buy ice cream. So the ice cream and crime are correlated, they're related to each other, but they're not causing one another. Something else is actually causing both of them. It's not always that simple that one thing is causing two things that are related. Sometimes two things can be related for no real causal reason at all. Alright, so let's talk about ageism and stereotyping of older adults. So ageism is that prejudice against people because of their age. So this can relate to younger children. You might see also ageism against adolescents and even early adults. Often, well, I'm a millennial, so often I see ageist comments against millennials as a group. So it can be pretty rampant anyway. Across lots of different ages, not just one. But with that, older adults in late adulthood tend to be seen as incapable of thinking clearly, even if they've shown no signs of dementia or no problems like that. People might attribute maybe a slip up of words to the fact that, or to their own idea that that person is incapable of thinking clearly. People often see them as incapable of holding responsible jobs. People also think of older adults as not enjoying or not trying to have sex, and then also that they are not able to contribute to their community. So these are some of the general stereotypes or ageism things that happens with older adults. With that, we'll come back to the ageism in a second. So within the society in the U.S., there is a concern also that the U.S. economy can't bear the burden of older persons who are generally consumers. So you might have heard of Social Security running out, things like that. So that is a concern. Healthcare, older adults do have increased healthcare costs, and so companies might not want to keep an older adult on staff if they're going to have to be paying healthcare costs. So a lot of older adults are developing or have developed a chronic disease, and that increases healthcare costs as well. Elder care is essentially the physical and emotional caretaking of older family members. So if you say your neighbor took in their 85-year-old grandmother to take care of her, that would be an example of elder care. So with that, this is another context here is technology. So there are pros and cons to technology in older adults. So it does reduce the likelihood of being depressed by 1/3, which is a pretty significant drop. And with that, that's when older adults are connecting with their family, friends, or neighborhoods using things like smartphones, the internet, a variety of apps, social networking. They tend to have higher psychological well-being than older adults who don't use those. With that, older adults age 65 and older tend to watch an average of 51 hours of TV a week, and that contributes to a lot of sedentary behavior and less social and physical behavior. So if that's what they're doing is spending their time with TV versus interacting with family or friends, even if it's just through technology, they are going to be more sedentary. They're going to have a lot worse outcomes. So let's talk about some diversities in lifestyle in late adulthood, and we'll touch on some other aspects of ageism as we go along too. So for married older adults, so there are about 58% of U.S. adults over 65 that are married. Marital satisfaction is greater in older adults than in middle-aged adults. Maybe they've figured it out by that point, so they're satisfied with their relationships. Retirement does often alter a couple's lifestyle, so there's not anymore going to work day to day. They're trying to figure out what to do with their time with each other, what to do with money, or what to do to get money, depending on what kind of financial situation they are in. When older adults are either married or partnered with a long-term partner, they tend to be happier and live longer than older adults who are single. With that as well, married LGBTQ individuals who are 50 years and older often report a better quality of life and more economic and social resources than their unmarried or even just partnered counterparts. So those who are married that are 50 and plus that are LGBTQ tend to have more economic and social resources even than people 50 and older who are just partnered. With that, divorce and separation still happens in late adulthood, or happens around and before or even after, well, throughout late adulthood. So in 2015, 13% of women and 11% of men 65 years or older in the U.S. were divorced or separated. I don't think I put a stat on here of how common it is after the age of 65, but it is still a possibility to have divorce. So divorce does have social, financial, and physical consequences. It can be difficult when you've had, let's say, two sides of a family that you've been relying on your whole life. You get divorced, and then you don't really have as much access to that family or in the same way that you did before. So remarriage is increasing even in late adulthood because of things like rising divorce rates, as well as the fact that people are living so much longer. So if people are getting divorced when they're 60 or 65, they might still be alive 15, 20, 25, 30 years later, so they might have another marriage, even in that late point of their life. So with that, older adults are also cohabitating. In 2016, approximately 3% of older adults were cohabitating. Some research suggests that this is often more for companionship than for romantic love. This statement here just says love, but as we know, there's a lot of different types of love. So if you remember, we have the critical components in the triarchic theory of love. So we've got intimacy, which is sharing things about yourself. We have passion, which is that desire to be physical with someone. And then we also have commitment, which is spending time, being there for someone, those three pieces. So this is specifically, I think, trying to refer to the fact that some cohabitating adults are cohabitating not for that physical piece, so that passion piece of that triarchic theory of love, but more that they're cohabitating when they want that intimacy and commitment with each other. Although that's not to say that older adults are not looking also for that passion. That is also a thing that older adults care about and are interested in, but it's not a very well-researched topic. Honestly, the most research on passion in older adults is probably the literature on STD and STI transmission rates in older adults, because it tends to be quite high, which is a big risk factor. It can create lots of complications, but definitely an area that could use more research. But I think it's one of those areas people are generally just not interested in, or maybe they think of like their grandparents being physical with each other and like, ooh, that's icky or something like that. I don't know. For whatever reason, I mean, I'm also not doing research on it myself, so who am I to say this needs to have more research? But I can't research everything, right? I have my interests in research, pro-social behavior, moral development, heroism, purpose in life. Yeah, it's just not one of those things that I guess I'm not passionate in researching late adults' passion. Um, that's funny. It's funny to myself. Hopefully, it's funny to other students. Um, with that, definitely something that is kind of missing from the book, as well as missing from the literature in general. With that, psychological well-being for men seems to increase more than for women, especially specifically when they're cohabitating. So I know we've kind of gone on a couple tangents here. But jumping back to cohabitating older adults, it does seem to increase the psychological well-being for men more than for women. Older adults tend to have fewer attachment relationships than younger adults. So one of the reasons for that might be that they are selecting relationships that they find more meaningful. It also might be that maybe some of their friends are passing away or they're physically not able to get to each other, and some of those friends also don't want to use technology or don't know how to use technology. So there's a lot of different reasons this could be. With increasing age, attachment anxiety decreases, so they're less concerned with being attached to more people, and they maybe find more meaning in those attachments that they do have. In late adulthood, attachment security is associated with greater psychological and physical well-being than attachment anxiety, which is kind of true across the lifespan. If you have attachment security, you tend to have higher well-being. So insecure attachment is linked to more perceived negative caregiver burden in caring for patients with Alzheimer's disease, which isn't too surprising. If you think about the cognitive deficits that are occurring with Alzheimer's disease, and you take someone who had an insecure attachment their entire life, so in childhood they didn't feel like they could trust on their caregiver, maybe in their romantic relationships they didn't feel like they could rely on their partner. They get to late adulthood and they're getting cared for by nurses that are changing fairly frequently. There's a really high turnover rate for elder care, essentially. So let's say even if someone's you're a nurse for 2 years, which depending on insurances and medical providers and the way they change rules and companies that they select, is actually quite a long time for an elder to be cared for by the same individual for 2 years. That is unfortunately fairly rare. So someone with an insecure attachment already, they have people coming in and out of their life all the time. That's going to be really hard for them, and they don't have the cognitive ability to be thinking about them. Sorry, I just accidentally shot a little child safety plug at the camera. That's kind of funny. I'm going to try to remember to come back and see if I actually hit near the camera and if you could see it in the video. I'm saying this to myself, not to let you know that, mostly as a tool for my memory to actually try to remember that. 80% of older adults do have living children, many of whom are in their middle age, so they would be middle adulthood at this point. With that, older daughters are more likely to be involved in the lives of their aging parents, and then adult children often coordinate together to monitor services for aging and disabled parents. So, and that can be really useful for them to spread that responsibility across multiple children rather than just one child taking on that whole responsibility. I'm just thinking of when I get to late adulthood, I only have 2 children. So hopefully they can spread that responsibility well between just the 2 of them. Who am I kidding? In this system, I'll have to work and do things until the day after I die. Anyway, that got dark quick. Friendships. In late adulthood, new friendships are less likely to be forged. It's more likely to keep your close friends rather than choose new friends. Even reconnecting with people or deepening connections with people that you've maybe been acquainted with and make them more friends rather than going out and meeting new friends. Friendships tend to be less problematic and negative than in younger years. So if you think back to childhood, a lot of friendships in boys, for example, in early childhood are marked by literal fighting, like fist fighting and conflict. And then even in adolescence, there's often more conflict. Um, but as you get into later adulthood, maybe they're selecting friends that they don't have those conflicts with, or perhaps it's also that they've learned how to work around differences and manage those things to have less problems in later adulthood. Friendships are more important than family in predicting mental health. So, what that means, or putting that in another way, studies have found stronger effect sizes and correlations. So, a correlation of, say, it's probably not this high, but zero point 0.8 for the relationship between good mental health and friendships, and say a correlation of 0.6, which is lower for family and positive mental health. So, older adults who have more close friends or stronger relationships or more meaningful relationships with friends tend to have better mental health than people who, so you take one with friends but no family relationship versus someone with family relationship but no friendships. The people with the friendships are more likely to have positive mental health. Hopefully that putting it in a couple different ways helps you understand that fact there. So individuals with close ties to friends are less likely to die. Oh, okay. Convoy model of social relations. I was reading that completely incorrectly as I was reading this. I was like, I didn't remember putting this in here. So essentially, this is the idea that throughout life, an individual is within a context. So within that context, they have their family, their friends, members that are socially important to them, that give them social support. So in adolescence, those social people who are around them in their microsystem are really important for starting to figure out their sense of self and their identity. In late adulthood, their relationships that they can build on and enjoy, and a lot of the same reasons friendships are important in adolescence, really. But this is called the convoy model of social relations, that these social relationships have shifts and changes within their context as people age. So you might have a relationship with mentors or peers or teachers in adolescence, but then as things move to late adulthood, you probably don't have a mentor anymore. You might be a mentor now. You probably don't have teachers. You might be a teacher now, right? But you probably still have friends, so that stays the same. So that convoy of life, you still have social support at all points in life, but it's going to look a little different in late adulthood than it does in adolescence, early adulthood. This is another point of that time through these systems theories. So Bronfenbrenner, Lerner, these theories, we have different contexts that are affecting an individual at different times in their life. Speaking of Bronfenbrenner, here you go. So altruism and volunteering, some of my favorite topics again. This is why I often emphasize them at different points in the lifespan. So older adults with persistently low or declining feelings of uselessness or of usefulness to others are at an increased risk of early death. So if an older adult feels like they're not really giving back, not really providing to people, that they're not very useful to people, they tend to die earlier than people who feel like they're valuable, that feel like they're giving back to people, that they're providing things for the world. I would say this is probably the case anytime after late childhood, honestly. But I don't actually know the studies of that in middle adulthood, so I won't say that for sure. But volunteering is one way that you can be of use and be useful and do things that are providing and giving back throughout lifespan. So doing things that are constructive and productive, planting trees, getting out there and actually physically doing something rather than just necessarily managing or organizing or setting schedules and whatnot. So that helps you be more socially integrated when you're actually doing activities with other people who are volunteering. and it helps enhance your meaningfulness in life, which, as we've talked quite a few times, is very, very important. Oh, it looks like I haven't been full screen this whole time. Oops. My mistake. I thought there was one other piece here. All right, and that is also related to a lower risk of cognitive impairment. And this makes sense based on what we were talking about last time with cognition, is that if you don't use it, you lose it. So if you are involved with other people, you're doing volunteering, you're involved in your community, you're helping younger people, you're using your abilities, you're going to tend to maintain those abilities better. All right, let's talk about ethnicity, gender, and culture. So elderly ethnic minority individuals face both ageism as well as racism. So African Americans and Latinos, for example, are really overrepresented in poverty statistics. So people who are African American or Latino and elderly, they've got a couple things that are challenges, a bunch of risk factors. They're elderly, so they have that kind of ageism. Based on their race, they might be facing racism. If they're in poverty, they also have that risk factor. So all these things can add up to lead to the potential for a lot worse outcomes. So these are all risk factors that if you look at that Plinko board or that waterfall, the developmental cascades idea, all these risk factors can really kind of put you towards that negative outcome as opposed to that positive outcome. So with that, elderly ethnic minority individuals are more likely to become ill, but they're less likely to receive treatment for those illnesses. They may never reach, essentially they may die before they reach the age for Social Security and Medicare, which is awful. I mean, there's a lot of things I would like to say about that. But I think awful sums it up pretty well. It doesn't take me on too much of tangents. Essentially, having these additional risk factors could be prevented and could be, maybe not entirely prevented, but could be, these people who are elderly and also ethnic minorities could be provided for better. Yeah, that's a good place. So with that, despite the stress and discrimination that elderly minorities face, many ethnic minority individuals actually develop a lot of coping mechanisms for survival, which good, people are resilient, like this is awesome, but also the fact that they need to develop survival coping mechanisms is kind of a real big indictment, is a real big, you're doing a bad job to us, the world, people who live in it, with these people, with all people. We need to do a better job. So with that, when they have these coping mechanisms, there is something called the happiness paradox, that even though they're in all these risk factors, they're elderly, they're an ethnic minority, they're in a low income area, they might still be happy. Positive psychology does a really good job looking at things that do make us happy, and even if you have all those risk factors, you still have the opportunity to have really meaningful relationships with family or friends, things like that. You might be having to be engaged in your community, right? So those things can build happiness even if you're in a really terrible situation because of the context that you're in. You can still be happy, essentially, which is good. We can also help people be happy and not live in terrible situations. That'd be cool too, right? That's another thing positive psychology does. Looks at positive institutions, evaluates things like interventions, whether it be like community level or state level or federal level, from the government or even nonprofits, things like that. Extended family networks really help, are one of the biggest protective factors. So you have this risk factor of that you are a late adult. You have a risk factor that you are ethnic minority. You have a risk factor that you're in a low SES place. If you have an extended family network, that's a huge protective factor. So three of those are from your screen level. Three of those are bumping you towards these negative outcomes, but the extended family network might bump you quite a ways towards positive outcomes. Churches also tend to be really important, and church religious communities tend to be really important and a really big protective factor for elderly adults, especially ethnic minority ones. And they're also, we'll get this fact and then we'll jump back into problems with the world. So there does seem to be, this one kind of hits on problems with the world too. So there might be just a decreasing femininity in women during and decreasing masculinity in men during late adulthood. It's a funny way to say men and women in late adulthood are not that much different. Like, we have these gender schemas, gender scripts, gender roles that we assign people as a society. Gender is a socially constructed concept, right? And it seems that as they age, older men do become more nurturing, more sensitive, which is generally perceived of as more feminine traits, right? These aren't things that females exclusively have, as nurturing and sensitivity. But it doesn't seem women don't necessarily seem to become more assertive or dominant, which we seem to be more masculine traits. Essentially, older adults tend to just, maybe we can just see older adults more as people than as a girl or a boy. I don't know. I think there's a lot of aspects in this research that you could ask questions about. Let's move on to the next thing. So with that, an older adult female faces ageism and sexism. And then if you're also ethnic minority, you might add that. So you've got this kind of triple jeopardy thing, where you've got a female ethnic minority who's an older adult, and they're facing those multiple levels of discrimination. So those are huge risk factors. That's really problematic. Let's fix this, please. So I'm trying to do my part in different ways, both in like professional life as well as private life. You might have heard this idea that there's multiple risk factors referred to as intersectionality. So the multiple different contexts, one lay term that really gets at this idea of multiple contexts affecting one person. One way that is talked about in some circles is as intersectionality. Essentially what it is just another term to say there's a lot of different contexts that are affecting the risk and protective factors and the life of developing humans. So, culture is actually a really big factor that's important to living a good life as an older adult. So it's related to health, security, as well as kinship and support. So with that, the culture of the world in general seems to be that to be a high status older adult, you tend to have need valuable knowledge, or knowledge that others find valuable. You have control of key family and community resources. Also that you engage in useful or valued functions as long as possible. So you can see here a lot of these are kind of the value of these is kind of determined by outside forces, which isn't the best. So if you've got a lot of great knowledge on how to play a violin, or how to do architecture, or how to lay concrete correctly, or something like that, if nobody wants that knowledge, they might not see it as valuable, as an example. And then people also look at your role throughout your lifespan. They kind of judge you not only as where you are now as an older adult, but also where you were 20 plus years ago. So age-related changes give greater responsibility and authority and advisory capacity to older adults. So in most cultures, older adults are seen as people who should be respected, who might be able to be given more responsibility. You might not give them a job, but you might respect your elders, right? Sorry, now I'm feeling a little bit more bitter about the problems facing older adults as I'm talking about this, and we've been talking about these risk factors. So with that, your extended family might view you differently, respect you more, look to you for advice and wisdom, and things like that. So this is a really good video about two elderly people looking or talking about their pursuits, or the pursuits that they have in their life. So let's watch that and talk about how that is related to successful aging.
Just a drop of water, and it never talks back to you. That's what I like about it. If you're taking pictures of people, they talk back. Is my hair just right? Am I posed right? Which is my better side? Water never says anything. It keeps quiet and drops. I was always interested in photography. I've probably taken pictures longer, or taken more pictures than anybody in the whole world. After all, I'll be 102, and I started taking pictures at the age of 8. That makes 94 years of picture taking. That's a lot of pictures in a long time.
After a century, Irving Olson is still learning new tricks. He uses the latest technology to capture nature's tiniest details, from the shape of a water drop to an insect's gaze.
Nature needs me. It can't operate without me. It would never get publicity. I love difficult pictures like this one here.
And just as he's found a formula for his photographs, he's also developed a formula for living as long as he has.
It's a 3-part formula. It's very simple. If you count to 3, you can live to 100. First part of the formula, 50%. You have to have the right spouse. If you have the right spouse, you're halfway there. 45%, everything in moderation. You don't sleep too much, don't eat too much. Do everything just exactly right. Now, there's 5% less if you've been following me. That 5% is very difficult, but for me it's easy. Would you like to know what it is? I thought you'd never ask. Anyway, I'll tell you what it is. You do not, under any circumstances, take any crap from anyone.
At the University of Arizona and elsewhere, researchers are interested in Irving's formula, and Irving himself. They're studying the oldest people among us to learn the secrets of successful aging.
People who are able to maintain high levels of cognitive ability as they age throughout the course of their lifespan can be considered as having achieved successful aging. It's really being able to maintain how you functioned all your life as you age, and not having major changes or declines in your cognitive ability as some people can experience. Looking at successful aging, we're really just trying to understand why some people are able to do really well as they age and others not.
Genes play an important role, but researchers are learning that other factors may matter just as much. Staying active, eating well, and sleeping enough have all been associated with longer, healthier lives. What may matter most is something that's hard to measure: how we engage with the world.
There are some good associational studies that have shown that being engaged, being socially connected is beneficial to your cognitive health and your outcome over life. It goes hand in hand with your cognitive health, is to be emotionally engaged and happy and feeling fulfilled. And those kinds of aspects are just as important in terms of experiencing a good, successful quality of life as you age. It's projected that the elderly community will double over the next several decades. So this is going to become an increasingly important issue, that we understand what are the benefits and what are the causes of difficulties as we age, because there are going to be more and more people who are going to be experiencing these problems. So it's not only a problem for the individual or the family or the community, but it's also a huge public health issue.
Let's say thanks for redoing our webpage.
Activist Marian Lupu has always believed that this public health issue demands public action. Almost 50 years ago, she founded the organization that would become the Pima Council on Aging to give more people a chance to age successfully.
When I started, our only service was one nursing home in the community. Most of the social agencies did not serve the elderly.
Since then, Marion has seen services grow and attitudes change, but she still recognizes societal obstacles to aging well.
In some cultures, aging has a much more reverence than we do here. And I don't know that reverence for the elderly really is as important as just teaching people at a very early age that there will be disabilities and how they overcome them. If we could develop relationships with young people for them to recognize that they will grow old, and what do they want in the community to be there when they are old, and what is it that we need to put in the society that are supports.
Now 90 years old, Marion has her own definition of successful aging.
To me, success is not wishing that you wouldn't be here tomorrow morning, that you would just close your eyes and go away. To me, successful aging is for the person to enjoy the latter stages of their life. And of course, that means, from my perspective solely, is that you have to find what it is that gives you kicks.
Irving Olson has no doubt about what gives him kicks, and no plans to stop searching for the next thing that makes his life worth living.
Now, since it's so hard to get around, I can't walk all day like I used to. Now it's simple. I just stand over a tray of water, drop water in, and I've got pictures. That's my latest thing. Next year I hope to have a new kind of hobby going. I haven't picked it yet, but I'll have something new.
I like those ones. I think they give really great examples of two different people who are involved in their own lives doing things that they find meaningful and useful. Taking pictures, adjusting for physical capacities. I think his name was Earl. Can't walk around as much as he used to, but he can still take pictures, do that hobby. He can find something new the next year as well. I like the idea of not taking crap from anybody as one of the key pieces of a successful life, and also some of the wisdom of the other person of trying to help encourage people to understand that we're all in the same boat. We're all aging, and so what are supports that we want in the community for the future that we'll be in? That's important too. And living a life that we can enjoy as well as being an aspect of successful aging. So a lot of the points that they've talked about, we've talked about as well. Hopefully you can pick out some things. Oh yeah, this study said this, or this study said this, as aspects that they are hitting on. With that, a lot of abilities can be maintained and improved in older adults due to things like proper diet, having a more active lifestyle, stimulating their mental capacities and having more flexibility in how they do things, coping skills. So a lot of the risk factors and challenges, whether they be physical or cognitive or social that we've talked about, can be helped or improved or maintained with these things: a proper diet, having an active lifestyle, stimulating your mental faculties, learning and using positive coping skills, having good social relationships and support, whether that's family or friends or both, and the absence of disease, which that's one that can be controlled a little bit through things like active lifestyle and proper diet. But again, those risks increase in later adulthood. So 4 factors that really characterize successful aging from research and literature are proactive engagement. So both of those examples that we saw were really engaged with something in their life that they found meaningful, whether it be pictures or whether it be actually being engaged for other older adults. Wellness resources. So what resources are available to an elderly person to help them? Oh, there's Shadow. I think I did show you Shadow last time. Sorry for the distraction. So successful aging, engagement in the community, wellness resources, what healthcare providers, what things like dance classes or other things are available to elderly people to be well. Having a positive spirit, so having that kind of positive attitude, being optimistic, those kinds of things, and having valued relationships. Those are some of the most important things. So other people matter. You might remember that from Chris Peterson when we were talking about positive psychology. Other people matter is one of the biggest, most important things, period. And I mean, I do say that as a positive psychologist who focuses on positive developmental psychology and applying it to help people be more or develop more positively or successfully. But yeah, other people are super, super important. So this is the last slide for chapter 16. It is a little review on the chapter. When I clicked this link earlier when I went to test it, I could not find the video. It said it was lost, so I will try to find it and then just change the slides. So hopefully when you click it when you're looking through the slides, you'll be able to watch this one. But right now it's dead, so I'll see if I can find it. So we will move on to the end of life and what happens with family, dealing with things after a person's death. So the process of grieving and things like that in chapter 17.